For decades, owning a home has been glorified as the ultimate achievement, and the North American society sincerely believed that true happiness comes from buying a home, planting a tree, and making a baby. But what if I told you that home ownership in itself is the most powerful way for the government to control the population? Take Switzerland, for example. With one of the highest ranked GDPs per capita in the world, it ranks absolute last in Europe in terms of home ownership, sitting at around 42%, and that number has only declined over the last decade. And despite that, the Swiss folk seems to be really happy with their life. Most people living in Switzerland are employed, and they earn a good salary. Swiss life expectancy is 84 years old, 4 years longer than the OECD average and almost 3 years longer than Canada. Could it be that they're winning 3 years of their life just for not having to stress about making mortgage payments? Okay, let's look on the flip side. What are the countries with the highest home ownership rates? Albania, Romania have some of the highest home ownership rates in Europe at 96%. How's their quality of life? Well, they are at the bottom of the GDP per capita rankings in Europe, and they happen to be the poorest countries in Europe. Portugal, Spain, and Greece also have relatively low earnings per capita ratios, while scoring high on home ownership figures at around 75%. Zooming out on the world, Russia, India, and China have some of the absolute highest home ownership rates in the world. How awesome do you think life is in those countries? Homeownership was not really a thing up until 1900s. In fact, there were times in history when the government used to give away land left and right. Eventually, that stopped, and home ownership has become accessible to an upper class only, with initial mortgages requiring as much as 50% down payment requirement and just a 5-year mortgage repayment plan. That's how it started in the US. In Canada, things started picking up after the World War I, when the first federal housing program was created to issue $25 million in loan funds to provinces in hopes to create employment during the period of post-war reconstruction, to support returning veterans and their new foreign wives, and, among other reasons, ameliorate social unrest. This is the point that I will get to later, actually. Then, the World War II started, and a sudden influx of workers participating in the war effort has created one of the first housing shortages in the country. Eventually, in 1946, the Canadian Mortgage and Housing Corporation, or CMHC, was created to oversee bigger and better housing programs in the country. The programs they launched over the course of the next 10 years have lowered barriers to home ownership, helping majority of middle-class Canadians buy a home. So from 1930s to early 2000s, the rate of home ownership in Canada shot up from 30% to 70%. Yet, it was continuously believed that housing was not affordable throughout the 50s. It is a curious observation that, according to the official documentation, opposition to social housing goes as far back as late 40s, where former Prime Minister Louis Saint Laurent heavily opposed subsidized housing. And here's what the successive federal governments continuously chose to believe instead. I'm going to read off this document here. Favorable mortgage assistance and other indirect incentives in the marketplace would provide adequate housing for many, and that the vacated stock would filter down to lower income groups. So in other words, the government believed that they should support the population that could afford homes, and assumed that the homes that this population vacates will get inherited by the lower income groups. If only everything was that simple. Nevertheless, this kind of thinking has seemingly dominated the Canadian policies for decades, focusing on serving the productive populations with a higher paying propensity. So the housing crisis we're experiencing today in Canada is not new at all.
And so they leave, reluctantly it seems, for they both would like to have this place for their very own. Too bad they can't afford it.
So this is an excerpt from the Evolution of Canadian Housing Policy document. Here's what it reads. The population of the country more than doubled in the post-war period, while the number of households and the number of dwelling units required more than tripled. One of the more significant social and cultural trends is the decrease in the average household size from 4.5 to 2.7 in 1986. This reduction in household size, coupled with the overall population growth, is the major factor in the high demand for housing in post-war Canada. So now take that document and swap the dates to 2024, and you won't see any difference really. We have rise in individuals living alone, higher standards of living, and an overall rise of non-family households. All these have been causes for the housing crises since the 1970s. Things have not changed since then. Construction was not fast enough then, and it's pretty much the same issue today. Poverty in Canada is not a new concept either. We're just more connected and people have more platforms to speak up on, which is a great thing.
Too bad they can't afford it. But maybe they can.
The biggest shift for the Canadian homeownership happened in early 1970s when the first-time home buyer program was introduced. And the federal government set up a special $200 million fund to encourage innovative housing programs for medium and low-income families. What did innovation look like then? Well, reducing unit sizes and increasing density. There were also two critical things that have happened at that time. Capital gain tax reform and the rental income tax incentives introduced at around that time have become probably the single largest incentives for Canadians to buy, sell, and lease homes. Fast forward to today, buying, selling, and leasing property represents the largest segment of Canada's national GDP at 13%. The American dream of owning a home and planting a tree has infiltrated Canada, thanks to cheap borrowing, huge tax incentives, and the Canadian Conference on Housing held in 1968, which declared that all Canadians have the right to be adequately housed whether they can afford it or not. And so it began. Suddenly, most Canadians believe that they must own a home to be accomplished, and most importantly, feel secure. In reality, home ownership has more to do with politics than it does with our own well-being. If you have a mortgage to pay, you will have a higher financial responsibility, and that means you will work harder not to be fired. You'll do your best to secure your raises and promotions, and that's good for productivity, at least in theory. On the contrary, when you don't own anything, you have no real motivation to work hard and be productive. One of many reasons why communism didn't work out, by the way. Owning a home is an asset to the government, and your property taxes are rent you pay to the government. When you're tied down to mortgages and property taxes, you're less likely to take risks, you're less likely to move to another city, let alone another country. Selling a home is not easy. It may take weeks, if not months, to sell a home. It involves heavy paperwork, lawyers, real estate, and even banking fees. Speaking of banks, look at this here. This is how much TD Bank has made in the last decade. You will notice that interest income accounts for nearly 60% of the bank's revenues. This is just another sign of how reliant Canadian banks and Canadian economy are on people buying and selling property. So the government is greatly benefiting from more homeowners, since homeowners are diligent and predictable layers of society. It's a stable revenue stream. Homeowners' goal is to maximize their incomes and to remain employed for as long as possible in order to ensure that they're paying off their mortgage. And that's making both banks and the government happy. And if you suddenly aren't able to do that, the bank or the government can take that home back. It's a win-win situation for the government. But is it a win situation for us? Let's look back at those countries with higher home ownership rates. The thing is, people in the poorer countries tend to want to own their own homes for two major reasons. One, they live in poorer and less stable economies and therefore seek more security and stability for themselves. And second, poorer economies have less social security benefits, like retirement, which in turn creates more uncertainty in one's future. So owning a home is one of the major ways to ensure that you have a roof above your head in the future. All this is despite a generally higher cost of borrowing in those countries and a generally lower property prices as well. Rich European Union countries, in turn, boast a wide social security net. They also don't mind for their residents to move around, encouraging high physical and, in turn, economical mobility, thanks to the EU treaty. It is also worth mentioning that richer EU countries are more risk-averse and conservative. They have a general disdain for credits and loans. Culturally, they regard buying a home as finding a place where you will settle and live for decades to come. The North American mentality and the heavy reliance on credits has turned home ownership into a get-rich-quick scheme, with people flipping homes every few years, which artificially inflates the prices and eventually creates bubbles. It is a dream sold to North Americans by banks who optimize for keeping you in debt and paying interest for as long as possible. The latest plans to introduce a 40-year-old mortgage is just another piece of evidence for that. European government chooses to invest in productive assets like R&D, which yields higher productivity, competition, and innovation. This creates a stable economy and a happy population. Canadian productivity in return is in a dumpster. With continuously declining GDP, flipping properties is what's practically been keeping the economy alive. No innovation, no competition, no productivity. Sure, we're adding jobs to the construction and renovation industry, but it has a minimal effect on the economy, mostly creating low added value jobs, and that only helps Canadian oligopolies grow stronger. So does this mean that we should all ditch the idea of owning a home? Not necessarily. Home ownership is not a means to an end. It's also not a mean to become rich quickly. Owning a home will not magically make you richer or happier just out of nowhere. It will change your lifestyle, that's for sure. And for that, we should all start thinking about home ownership as an emotional lifestyle decision, not an investment or get-rich-quick decision. Historically, this obsession with home ownership has stemmed from a combination of cultural influences and government policies dating back to the post-World War II era. But times have changed, and so have our priorities. Instead of blindly pursuing a piece of the American dream, let's focus on creating lives that align with our values and priorities, whether that includes owning a home or not. Do you still plan to buy a home? Let me know in the comments below and hit the like button if you've learned something new today. I definitely have a lot. Thanks so much for watching, and let me know in the comments below if you like this format of the video. If you're a real estate expert who wants to chat more in depth about the state of the housing in Canada and the world, shoot us an email. We'd love to talk. Take care, guys. See you next time.